good to see you. It's good to be here. Glad that you are here. We missed you Sunday. We made a quick trip to Tampa, Florida, and had a wedding down there and made it back safe and sound. And Sunday I saw the back of most of your heads on the live stream, and so it was good to see the back of your heads. It is good to be able to be here tonight, and thankful that you're here. For those that are joining us online, we're glad that you are joining us as well. We'll be in Genesis, talking about these characters. We don't have a set passage that we're going to spend all of our time in, but we'll be in around Genesis 24 and down through 27 or so. We spent our time last week talking about Abraham, and had a good discussion, and appreciate your participation in that as always. And as I said, we're going to spend our time this evening talking about Isaac. Once I settled in that this is what we were going to do for a little while, then I started kind of going in order. I started out a few months ago and was just doing some hit or miss stuff. Some of it was on Sunday night, and but now that we're doing it on Wednesday, we're kind of, at least in my mind, going in some kind of chronological order. So we'll look at Isaac, and then we'll look at Jacob, and then probably Esau, and kind of what we'll be in the next 2 or 3 weeks. But I wanted to just make a couple of comments about Sarah. We spent some of our time, and certainly as we talked about Abraham, there was some discussion about Sarah, and we're reminded that she was old when she was told that she was going to have a son. It would be that promised son. And but even through before that, and there was some deception in regard to what they were telling folks about being Abraham's sister. And I say deception because it wasn't really a lie. I think she was a half-sister, wasn't she? But the deception was that she was also his wife, and that's what they were trying to deceive about. But anyway, there was deception involved there. We see in chapter 11, verse 29 through the first few verses of Genesis chapter 12 as well. And then on up in Genesis chapter 20, we see more in regard to the deception that was involved. And then we alluded to it last week in regard to Abraham, but also Sarah took matters into her own hands regarding Abraham having a son. And that's relayed in chapter 16, the first 15 or 16 verses, where she got Hagar involved. But at any rate, she took matters into her own hands. I don't think we did mention it last week, but both Sarah and Abraham laughed when they were told about having a child. Chapter 18, verses 10, a few verses there around verse 10, in relating to Sarah and that laughing in disbelief, and that plays into the name of Isaac, in Hebrew meaning he laughs. And but as we think about Sarah, as we do with all of these characters that we talk about, there's some things that we can learn and some lessons that we need to learn as we think about these folks. And with Sarah, we can be reminded of the fact that God's promises are fulfilled according to his timetable. And I know we mentioned that last week. I think Shelley was the one that kind of mentioned that. We talked about God's promises. God keeps his promises. But we also need to remember that God keeps his promises on his timetable. And certainly that's valuable for us today to remember that, and we need to resist the urge to rush ahead of God. Quite frankly, sometimes we don't allow God to keep his promises. We don't allow God to work in his time because we get, as we say, the cart before the horse, and we rush ahead of God. So, reminded from Sarah that God keeps his promises and they're fulfilled, but it's going to be on his time. Secondly, another lesson is that no problem is too big for God. That sounds simplistic, but yet it's worth remembering. I would ask you to raise your hand, but there's no reason for me to ask you to raise a hand because I know all of us would raise our hands. Who in here has problems? Well, all of us have problems. Some of us have big problems. Some of us have little problems. Some of us think our problems are bigger than others, but all of us have problems. We have concerns. We have things that we wish were different, perhaps. So it's good for us to remember that there is nothing that is too big for God. Sometimes it's difficult for us to remember that because we're used to doing what we want to do when we want to do it. And we have a hard time allowing God to show his power, and that nothing is too big. I can think in my life, and I'm sure many of you can think about times in your life that things seemed hopeless. And then that just turned into an opportunity for us to trust God. And remember, that's where I wanted us to land last week as we talked about Abraham, not so much because we always talk about Abraham's faith. But as we think about Abraham's faith, and if we look at Abraham like we did last week and some ideas just a little bit differently, then we really see the grace of God working through Abraham's faith. And that's what it takes to make things work, spiritually speaking. That's what it takes to make things work in the life of a Christian. That's what it took for the walls of Jericho to fall. I could ask you, what caused the walls of Jericho to fall? Was it God's grace or man's faith? The answer to that is yes. The walls of Jericho would not have fallen without the people having faith in God and doing that silly thing of marching around one time for 6 days, and on the seventh day marching around 7 times, and then blowing their horns and busting their pitchers and making a lot of noise. What a silly, silly thing. Not really. See, that was man's faith. But also the walls of Jericho would not have fallen without the grace of God. I think of it this way. The grace of God meets the faith of man, and great things happen because of that. And these Bible characters allow us to see that. And then finally, I would mention in regard to Sarah and the lessons that we can learn is that the answers to God's promises or the fulfillment of God's promises often come in mysterious ways. Don't try to guess how God will work in our lives. And if you'll remember the devotional time last week, we talked about that passage where Abraham told Isaac that God will provide the lamb. Did he know how? No. And so God, some of these things, some of the answers carrying out that thought. Did Isaac know that there was going to be a sacrifice in the thicket? There was going to be an animal in the bushes to pull out. No, he didn't know that. Did he know that his hand was going to be stilled as he was bringing the knife down? No, he didn't know that. But he had faith that Abraham was going to be spared, that the promise was going to be fulfilled. He didn't have all of the answers, and that's where we need to be. And I mentioned a couple of verses we're familiar with. Seek ye first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things shall be added unto you. Matthew chapter 6 and verse 33. Can I explain that? No. But we need to have faith that when we seek God first, he's going to take care of us just like he takes care of the birds in the air and the lilies of the field. The effectual, fervent prayer of a righteous man avails much. How? I don't know. But God will provide. So these give us good opportunities to be reminded of those things. And God's promises often come in mysterious ways, or ways that we're not thinking about, or ways that we're not expecting. We just have to have the faith to allow God's grace to be perfected. So this gets us into another generation, and it's about to be ushered in with the birth of Isaac. God had promised Abraham and Sarah a son, and they were old when the promise came, but it was 25 more years before Isaac was born. And as instructed by God, the name was Isaac, which means he laughs. And we've already mentioned the fact that that was appropriate due to Sarah and Abraham's response when they were told that there was going to be a son. Isaac is significant in that he is a transitional figure. And don't you hate it that that word is tainted? When I just said the word transitional, then our society has tainted the word transition. But Isaac was a transitional figure. He inherits the pledge or the promise that God had made to Abraham, and that was that he was going to make a great nation in Genesis chapter 12 in verse 2. That promise, along with others, is now being passed down to Isaac. And we know that it will then be extended to Isaac's son. Not only did Isaac inherit the promise of God, but he also inherited a great deal of Abraham's wealth. And certainly by the standard of his time, Isaac was a wealthy man. It seems that Scripture portrays Isaac as a passive man. Don't really see any bold actions, but he's content. He's content to live in that land in tents and leading his flocks and his herds. And every now and then we read about planting and harvesting grain. So even though he was wealthy, he was a farmer, a tiller of the ground, and a herder of sheep. Chapter 24, and we'll talk a little bit about some of the main things with Isaac, but in chapter 24 we have his betrothal to Rebekah. When Sarah died, Isaac is about 39 years old. And Abraham sends his trusted servant, Eliezer, sends him on a journey back to his own people in Haran, and that servant's bidding, his purpose in that trip was to find a wife for Isaac. Abraham is concerned about the idolatry of the people that are around them, and he desires to keep his family free from that idolatry. And so he sends this servant hundreds of miles to Abraham's homeland, where he meets, he being Eliezer, being the servant, where he meets Rebekah. As he gets to town, and Rebekah, as it turns out, was Isaac's second cousin. And they meet at the local watering hole. And not as we think about the local watering hole, but it was really the watering hole. It was the well, the watering well, outside of town or on the edge of town or right inside town. And that's where this servant happened to meet up with this lady. And she identifies her family to this servant, and she takes Eliezer back to her home where he meets her family, and he realizes that this is the answer to prayers. She's the answer to the purpose of his trip, and he quickly states his business, and she willingly agrees to return with him and become Isaac's bride. I don't know. Certainly it doesn't matter. I don't know if that was simpler times or more complicated times. You know, you think about it, it'd be one thing for mama or daddy to pick the wife. But here we got a servant picking the wife. Probably some significance in the fact that he's referred to as a trusted servant. And again, that doesn't make any difference, but she's willing to return and to become Isaac's wife. We get into chapter 25, and we see something about Isaac's dysfunctional family. Dysfunctional families have existed since the beginning of time, and Isaac's was one of those. He was 40 years old when he married Rebekah. They don't have any children until he's 60 years old. And he spent a lot of time during those 20 years praying for Rebekah to conceive. Most of us would remember and be familiar with that God grants Isaac's prayer, and they're going to have twins. Before the twins are born, then God tells Rebekah that contrary to the custom of the day, that the eldest son, Esau, would serve the younger son, Jacob. That's significant, isn't it? Sometimes we lose sight and we forget the fact that Rebekah was told this long before. The issue with the birthright or the issue with the blessing took place. But those things play right into what God told Rebekah that was going to happen, and that was that the older son would be serving the younger son. We don't fully understand, but we know about as much as we can know, I guess. The older son received a double portion. That was his birthright. And then he received a blessing the time the father was going to die. Those were two different things. I think sometimes we think about those things happening at the same time and happening together, but there were two different occasions that Esau or Jacob was taken advantage of, perhaps by Esau. But the twins grow up. Isaac and Rebekah fall into a trap. And the trap that they fall into is having a favorite. Hard for us to imagine. Perhaps, maybe not. I'm pretty sure Jack and Kathy have a favorite son. Pretty sure Pam and Jack have a favorite daughter. Jan is accused by two of her sons of having a favorite. They kid their mom a lot about Justin being the favorite. He's not the favorite, he's just the baby. And she says there's a difference in those two things. Seriously, turned into a problem, didn't it? For Isaac and Rebekah, and the things that transpired because of this favoritism. Isaac really, he favored Esau because of he was rough and he was rugged, and he had those outdoor skills. Now, there's nothing wrong with this that I'm about to say, but it's just the truth here. Jacob was a mama's boy. And Rebekah loved Jacob because he was mild-mannered. He wanted to be at home. He wanted to be a homebody. And the indication is he wanted to be near mama. And certainly this favoritism would later lead to a permanent dissolution of Isaac's family. Not a little rift, but yet it was a big deal. We move into chapter 26, and we have Isaac in his time among the Philistines. Following his father's pattern, Isaac moves his entire family and all of his possessions out of the land that they knew when a famine breaks out. And rather than go toward Egypt, Isaac moves toward the coastal land of the Philistines. God appears to Isaac and affirms that he will continue to bless Isaac in the land of the Philistines. In fact, God tells him that his descendants will one day occupy the very land that he is living in. So God continues to bless Isaac, so much so that the local king in that land asked Isaac to leave because of Isaac's prosperity. And as he's leaving, that king asked that a peace treaty be made between Isaac and himself. Moving into chapter 27, we have Isaac blessing his son Jacob. Isaac is old. He thinks that he is near death. And so he summons Esau, his eldest son, and following normal customs, then he desires to bless him. Now, remembering that God had previously told Rebekah that the older was going to serve the younger, and really kind of ignoring that fact and forgetting that Esau had in fact sold his birthright to Jacob. Let me rephrase that a little bit. There are three things, I think three things, that Isaac overlooked. As he was blessing Esau. One was the fact that God had told Rebekah, and Isaac knew that God had told Rebekah that the younger would, or the older would serve the younger. The second thing that Isaac, I keep saying Abraham, but that Isaac overlooked as he's blessing Esau or wanting to bless Esau, the second thing he overlooked is the knowledge that Esau had forfeited that blessing when he sold his birthright to Jacob. And the third thing that Isaac overlooks in his attempt to want to bless Esau is the fact that Esau's marriage, that he was married to idolatrous foreign women. Or I should say woman, as we see in chapter 26, verses 34 and 35. In spite of all three of those things, Isaac is still intent on giving the blessing to Esau. At that point in time, there was really, for all practical purposes, no reason for Isaac to continue to do that, yet that's what he does. But we know that because of Rebekah and Jacob's deception, that Isaac in his blind state gives the blessing to Jacob. Esau tries to get Dad to revoke it. Isaac refuses. Esau plots to kill his brother. Jacob is sent away to live with Rebekah's family before any harm could come to him. Comes at a high price for Rebekah, because the indication is she lives another 20 years and never sees that mama's boy again during those 20 years. Skipping up to chapter 35, about verse 29, we see something about Isaac's last years. Isaac lived to be 180, and that was 43 years. And I don't know that I remembered this. I probably forgot what I remembered. But that was 43 years after he thought he was dying, and he gave that blessing to Jacob. He lived another 43 years. And time seems to heal some of the hatred that Esau had toward his brother, and on his deathbed, then Isaac sees his two sons together, and they're reconciled to each other. Real quickly, before that second bell rings, what does this mean to us? What are the lessons that we can learn? And some of them are the same, but we need to reaffirm these lessons. First of all, God seemingly constantly reaffirms his promises to his people. And we see that with Abraham and Isaac, and how it's going to continue with Jacob and so on. God's promises are unfailing. He never forgets them. We might, but he will not. Sometimes God has to use differing avenues to remind us of his love and his care for us. We've alluded to it already, but the second lesson that we need to learn, and that is that favoritism in a family leads to strife and division. And we may think, well, that doesn't even need to be said, but it does need to be said. And I'm not saying that for us in here, but we need to be aware of it and understand it, and to help other people understand it. But favoritism in a family leads to strife and division. And it's difficult sometimes for parents to learn how to praise the qualities and abilities rather than focusing on personalities sometimes. And then finally, I would mention manipulation may get us what we want, but it's not going to get us what is best. And again, we've said it. We like things our way. We like to do things our way and have things our way. But we need to be sure that things are handled properly. And the idea of what transpired with Rebecca and Jacob and the manipulation that took place. And it goes back to what we talked about at the beginning, and that is allowing God to work in His time rather than what we think the time ought to be. Very good. I did more talking than usual. I appreciate you letting me do that, but we were able to get through what we needed to get through. Thank you very much for being here.
Good evening. Glad that you guys are here this evening. If you will, go ahead and fill out an attendance card. Kevin said you guys had a great class in here, and I'm not to mess anything up. So John Graber's just going to lead us in an invitation song, and we'll move on. Some of you looked excited. You were like, yes. But he said you guys had a good class, and we always enjoy those. A few announcements just to make mention of the individuals to keep in your prayers. You have not grabbed a bulletin. If you'll grab one of those, take note of all the things that are in there. One thing we do need to announce is that Barney Vineyard is recovering from surgery, and he's here today. So we're grateful that he was able to be with us. Also, Gladys Wallace, this is Ma, as we know her, part of Kim Martin's family. She's not feeling well, so continue to remember her in your prayers. Also, if you will, you may remember Alexis Looney. This is Phoenix's mom. She is going to be having a baby this weekend, so pray that all of that goes well. And also, our sympathy is extended to Edith Crane and the family of Adrian Turner and Sidney Selden and the passing of their sister Marilyn Jones. So that happened yesterday, I believe, so remember them in your prayers. Regarding upcoming events, this Sunday we're going to have our monthly singing night at 5 p.m., and following that we're going to have a meal together in our fellowship hall after services, so keep that in mind if you will. But leading our singing tonight is going to be John Graber. I'll have our devotional. Then after that, we have some more announcements to share with you.
Let's sing. I have found a friend in Jesus. He's everything to me. He's the fairest of 10,000 to my soul. The lily of the valley, in him alone I see. All I need to cleanse and make me fully whole. In sorrow he's my comfort, in trouble he's my stay. He tells me every care on him to grow. He's the lily of the valley, the bright and morning star. He's the fairest of 10,000 to my soul. He will never, never leave me, nor yet forsake me here, while I live by faith and do his blessed will. A wall of fire about me, I've nothing now to fear. With his man and me, my hungry soul shall fill. Then sweeping up to glory, to see his blessed face, where rivers of delight shall ever roll. He's the lily of the valley, the bright and morning star. He's the fairest of 10,000 to my soul.
This evening I want to share a passage of Scripture that's probably one of the most taken out of context passages in the Bible, in my opinion. It's from Matthew chapter 7, as we've kind of gone with the Sermon on the Mount on some Wednesday evenings. And the passage is about judging, but then again it's really not. And what I mean by that, it's about internal reflection. It's about the question that we've asked for years. Is it easier to see my mistakes, or is it easier to see the mistakes in others? Well, many times, if we're honest with ourselves, it's easier to see the mistakes in others. It's easy to look at somebody else and say, oh, look what they did, or look what they're doing, or just look at them, while we simply overlook ourselves. And why do we do that? Well, there's a lot of different reasons. Some of those are a comfort zone reason. It's very comfortable if we just kind of overlook what's going on in our life and we focus upon somebody else. It takes away responsibility. But notice what Jesus says in Matthew chapter 7 and verse 1. He says, judge not that you be not judged. Now, that's the verse that people say whenever they're doing something wrong, and you may tell them, hey, it looks like you have a problem. Looks like something's troubling you. It looks like there's an issue, and they say, don't judge me. The Bible says, judge not, lest ye be not judged. But, however, they miss the next part of this. Notice verse 2. For the judgment that you pronounce, you will be judged. And with the measure that you use, it will be measured to you. So he says, before you judge, remember who you are. Remember the difficulties that you've had. Now, I'm paraphrasing a lot. But look on down in verse 3. It says, why do you see the speck that is in your brother's eye, but do not notice the log that is in your own eye? This is quite possibly, and I don't mean to be disrespectful of the Bible, this is probably one of the funniest visual illustrations in the Bible. Because he is saying, why do you see that little small speck, smaller than a speck of sawdust, that's in your brother's eye? What that means is that you have to be critically looking. Not just looking, but critically looking. And not even just critically looking, but critically looking with the minute detail while there's a telephone pole sticking out of your head. Now, the illustration is pretty funny because when you think about it, the people there would go, yeah, we can see that. And what it really means is if you're breaking somebody down and even looking at the specs while you have a telephone pole sticking out of your own head, what gives you the right? Why not fix a telephone pole that's in your head? Now, if you don't think that's funny enough, just think about this later. Imagine somebody coming up to you and they say, hey, I want to talk to you about something. And you know they're critical. You know they're going to come at you very rough, but yet they come at you, and visually picture it, they're coming at you with a telephone pole. Your first response would be, that's not going to happen. And that's what Jesus tells them. He goes on down and he says this, or how can you say to your brother, let me take the speck out of your own eye? Okay, so now you've critically looked, you've critically examined, and now you say, let me fix it for you. While you still have a telephone pole sticking out of your own head. Do you start to see a comedic visualization? He's telling them that you have to look out for who you are. In fact, he says this in verse 5. He says, you hypocrite, which means play actor. He says, first take the log out of your own eye, then you will see clearly to take the speck out of your brother's eye. He's just told them, you know what? Before you go about and you tear somebody else down, maybe it's you that needs broken down first. Maybe it's you that needs broken down. You know, I know the ladies' Bible class, I believe this morning, talked about King David from Psalm 51. David's moment to critically look at his own life. And you know, it helps us. It helps us, and here's why. Because it doesn't tear us down. It helps us to realize the blessings. There's a difference in critically looking at somebody and saying to them, you've got a problem, as opposed to, I've had that problem. Let me help you out. Let me see what I can do. Not out of a critical nature, but out of a loving heart. Something to think about as you go through the week, but if there's anything that we can help you out with tonight, we encourage you. We don't want to judge because we know that God is the ultimate judge, but if you look at your life and you know you need Jesus, what's stopping you from obeying the gospel? If you need prayers of the church, what's stopping you from asking for prayers of the church? But if there's anything that we can do for you tonight, we ask that you make it known by coming to the front while together we stand and as we sing.